I want to talk about a thesis that provides insights in what it means to be a free person. It won't have quite the logical structure of some of the presentations we've heard, where they're very tightly organized. Some of the things I'm going to discuss are empirical observations. They're not logical demonstrations, but I believe them to be true and defensible. So let's start what I'm going to cover a little bit about what it means to love the liberty of others. The idea of liberty is not a zero-sum game. Some insights into what it means to be free. What is liberty? The idea of the presumption of liberty, which is foundational to the liberal view of the world. The relationship between liberty and social harmony or order. And then a little bit about psychology, the psychology of liberty. And then the mirror image of it, the psychology and the philosophy of enmity, of antagonism, of hostility and hatred, and then conclude with some thoughts about hatred. So let me start with a great hero of mine, the very important figure, Joaquim Nabuco. He was a man who spent years and years and years on behalf of justice because he loved the freedom of other people. He wrote a very important book, which I reread on the plane coming over here, just called Abolitionism. And it's about the case for the abolition of slavery. Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish that loathsome institution. And toward the end of it, he summed up his insight. We should educate your children, educate yourselves in the love for the freedom of others. Only in this way will your own freedom not be a gratuitous gift from fate. You'll be aware of its worth, and you will have the courage to defend it. So let's look a little bit into his own life. He dedicated really his whole life to this cause and was successful. He was able to eliminate this. At the age of 18, he founded a newspaper, a magazine, if you will, the Liberal Tribune. He became president of the Student Association, went to law school, and as a law student successfully defended a runaway slave, a person who was enslaved, had escaped, was captured, and tried, and they attempted to execute him. He was able to save him from the death penalty, but he was not able to save him from imprisonment. He then dedicated his life as a lawyer and as an activist and as a writer and a speaker to eliminating this horrifying practice. In 1883, he published this important book, Abolitionism. It's really an interesting work. He goes through the arguments, legal, moral, economic, psychological. He talked about the devastating impact of slavery on, obviously, the slaves, the enslaved people, but he said it poisoned the whole society. Connection to the previous presentation, one of the things it did was to make people unwilling to work. That was for slaves. And he said it enervated the rest of the society as well, because they looked down on labor as beneath them. And so the free population, much of it languished in poverty because they considered working was for slaves, and I'm not a slave. So he went through the horrifying impacts on the entire society of this poisonous institution. His focus was, of course, on the enslaved people, but also on the rest of society. He said, how can we let this happen? Look at what it does to us as well. We are poisoned by this horror. He was successful. 5 years later, they passed what is called the Golden Law in Brazil. Just the Golden Law. And in Portuguese, only 18 words. Very simple. From the date of this law, slavery is declared extinct in Brazil. And then the second clause, nothing can be contrary to this in law. Any existing statute or legal agreement was declared null and void. And later he became an ambassador. He represented Brazil in Washington, D.C., and was considered what they call the dean of the diplomatic corps, the most respected diplomat in Washington, the one to whom others from many other countries were turned to for advice and counsel. So this is an example of someone who really dedicated his life to this. But it's by no means the only instance. And here I turn to another country, to Poland and the Polish struggle for liberty. In 1831, there was the flag of the November Uprising, and it says, "In the name of God, for our and your liberty." This is what we fight for. And it was a symbol, a message to the Russians also uprising in Russia. We also stand with you. We want to liberate ourselves from the tyranny of the Tsar, but we also want you to be free as well. We don't hate you because of your language or your place of birth. And this slogan was very significant. By the way, I should point out a number of Poles had gone to the American colonies and fought in the American War of Independence. They considered that to be connected to their struggle for independence as well. This also was then painted on the planes of the Free Polish Air Force. Those Polish pilots who had escaped from Nazi and Soviet invasion went to Britain, and they had a squadron, and this was on their planes. That we fight for our freedom and for yours, all of you who are being threatened or subjected to these horrifying collectivist tyrannies. This is Emilia Plater leading troops against the Tsar's army. She was a great and heroic figure who rallied the soldiers on this cause. But now an echo that comes 1968, many, many years later. Soviet and Warsaw Pact troops move into Prague. Those of you who know Prague, you'll recognize this particular place here on Wenceslas Square, and suppressed the attempt of the people of that country to achieve some liberty, to escape from this horror, this nightmare of living in a prison. And a small group of very brave people on Red Square appeared, and this was their banner: "Za vashu i nashu svobodu," right? For our freedom and for yours. In this case, for yours and for ours, correct myself. All of them were imprisoned, every single one of them. And they knew it would happen. They knew that. But they wanted to stand there and say, we understand your struggle for freedom is ours as well. Now, we think about our common rational nature. There's been a lot of discussion at this conference about the distinctive feature of the human being. We're animals. We have things in common with other animals. We're physical beings. We have dimension and weight and mass like chairs and the tables and cameras and other things too. We're animals. We breathe. We have to take in nutrition. But we have some remarkable feature. We think. We have choice. Aristotle says prohairesis. We can, in a way, reach into the future and make choices about what we want to do. And one of the great figures who thought about this man Marcus Tullius Cicero, is a very important figure in European and now world history because of his influence. Cicero wrote and spoke beautiful Latin. And for this reason, we have more of his texts than virtually anyone else. Because to learn to read and write was to copy the works of Cicero. So we have so many copies of this. But we know a lot about the philosophy and the life and the politics of the ancient world because of this person. In the last year of his life, he wrote a book in the form of a message to his son, Marcus Tullius Cicero Minor, or the younger. who was at the time studying philosophy in Athens. And he knew, by the way, he was almost certainly going to be killed. So this is a kind of a final testament, his ideas about what it meant to live a good life that he was sharing with his son. And this passage, which then is quoted repeatedly for thousands of years, we are all constrained by one and the same law of nature. And if that is true, then we are certainly forbidden by the law of nature from acting violently against another person. So the fact that we recognize that we have a common nature, that we have the faculty of reason, and he also talks about our dignity, our seemliness, our good behavior that we're capable of, has certain implications for how we treat one another. That we don't treat other people like they were just instruments or chairs or objects or tools to be manipulated. Now, Immanuel Kant says something a bit similar. I know he has a bad odor for some people here. In my opinion, rather undeserved, just to be honest. Having spent many years reading his texts, I don't think most of the criticisms of him were fair, but we'll set that aside. But he says you don't want to treat people only as a means. He doesn't say never treat people as a means. That would be kind of crazy. When I go to the baker, I go there because I want to get bread, not because I'm there to admire how wonderful the baker is. But he says not to treat them only as a means. At the same time, to respect their moral agency, the feature about them that allows them to make choices such as we do. So what would be true, what would need to be true for this claim to be binding on us? It has also certain implications. We realize our liberty through respect for our rights. And we can expect respect for our rights when we respect the rights of other people to live in that society. As a little aside, you will notice that one feature of even very powerful people in tyrannies, you might think, well, they have all the freedom. They can do anything they want, including hurt other people. But then look at how many of them get executed, or has been happening now with the Russian elite. An astonishing number of billionaires have been falling out of hotel windows. Right? It's a very strange disease. By the way, you know how hard it is to fall out of a hotel window? Right? Don't try it. You really have to work at it. And so we know that they didn't do this on their own. This is a long practice. And of course, it was exercised against many non-powerful people. I remember a case in Russia when a journalist on his daughter's birthday had come up with a cake and a bag of oranges all the way through the stairs to the 8th floor, I think it was, of their building on his daughter's birthday, but then sadly threw himself out the window. We know he was executed. There's no question about that. But it was reported as how sad that he committed suicide, right? This is unfortunately common. Now it's happening to the top leaders as well. Those people, in a certain sense, do not enjoy liberty. They have power and privilege. They do not live in a free society where you can expect, as a normal course of affairs, you will not be thrown out the window or poisoned or all the other horrors that have been visited on people. So I want to talk a little bit of a history. This is going to be the most lengthy part of my presentation, a little history of the idea of individual rights. And it's not an in-depth discourse. For that, you can read all of my boring and tedious footnoted essays. I'm just going to skip lightly over the surface and pick up some of the highlights. So we can start. Marsilius of Padua, a very important and interesting figure, was an employee of Maximilian, the emperor, and he talked about ownership, and he uses here the term from Latin dominium, which comes from domus, a house, And in classical Roman law, the dominus was master of the house. And dominus had a power that was truly tyrannical within the house. Dominus absolutely ran it. But then this idea of dominium applied to the individual person over her or his own life, to be the master of it. So this idea of dominium refers to the human will or freedom in itself. It is through these that we are capable of certain acts and their opposites. In other words, I can choose to do this or that, this or just not this. These are choices that are open to me. And because of this, we say I have dominion. I am a self-controlling agent. I'm not a leaf being blown through the wind. I can choose where I want to go, obviously within constraints of various sorts. And it is for this reason man alone among the animals is said to have ownership or control of his acts. This term, to own your acts, very interesting phrase. You find it also in John Locke's writings, that a person owns his acts. They are attributed to that man or woman. And this control belongs to him by nature, not acquired through an act of will or choice, which is a natural feature of the human being. Sebastian Castellio is a figure who really deserves more thought and more appreciation. One of the great figures in the defense of liberty of conscience. And it's very convenient for people like me, I'm not a religious person, to think, here's the cartoon version of history that we get presented. There's religion and faith and lots of wars and people are burned alive, and then comes science and atheism, and then people stop doing that. This is actually not how it worked. It might be comfortable for someone like me who's not religious, but it's not the actual historical record. And I'm always alert not to think of the history I wish had happened, which is the way lots of people read history, but look at the historical record. What did happen? What did happen was that people of very deep and profound religious faith said, our religion calls us to favor freedom of conscience. And they were willing to die for this. So when he talked about Michael Servetus, in 1553, had been condemned in France for his heretical views, and he made a mistake, he went to Geneva. People wonder, like, why did he go to Geneva? And he attended a church service led by John Calvin, the theologian. And then Calvin had him arrested and burned alive because of his views that he considered to be heretical on various questions of Christian theology. And Sebastian Castellio denounced, he said, to kill a man is not to protect the doctrine, but it is to kill a man. He says that's what they did. They did not defend the truth. They just killed a person. He said, to protect the doctrine is not the magistrate's affair. What has the sword to do with doctrine? That is to say, faith or belief or ideas. It's the teacher's. It is the magistrate's affair to protect the teacher. In this case, Servetus was a teacher, should have been protected, as it is to protect the farmer and the smith and so on. Thus, if Servetus had wished to kill Calvin, the magistrate would properly have defended Calvin. But when Servetus fought with reasons and writings, he should have been repulsed by reason and writings, not by being arrested and burned to death. And then this remarkable phrase, we can live together, and this is the key, we can live together peacefully only when we control our intolerance, our desire to respond to words with violence. Even though there will always be differences of opinion from time to time, we can at any rate come to general understanding, can love one another, and it can enter the bonds of peace, pending the day when we shall attain unity of faith. Maybe someday in the future, we'll all figure out what is the exact true religion. Until that time, don't burn each other alive. Right? Learn to live in peace. And this message was quite significant and had a huge impact. Now we'll turn to this idea of rights. This idea then that what is necessary is for us to have rights. You have rights and I have rights. And those rights are fundamentally equal. We talk about two categories of rights in law. There's, or legal theory, connate rights, rights with birth, and adventitious rights. Those are the rights you get because of something you did. As an example, this amazing Vyshyvanka that I'm wearing right now from Ukraine is mine, not yours, because I went and bought it from the people who made it. So we wouldn't say having this Vyshyvanka is a human right. No, it's my personal right, distinct from yours to wear all the amazing clothes you're wearing. But our connate rights to acquire such things, to engage in exchange, to live, those are the same and equal for everyone. No one has more than another. Even though I have the shirt and you don't, that adventitious right, all of us have a unique bundle of rights in that way. But our fundamental core rights are all the same. This man, Francisco de Vitoria, in his book On the Indians, dealt with this question that the Spanish conquerors encountered. This is a whole land, they didn't really know how big this territory was, with all these creatures who look like us. They're featherless, they have 2 feet, they're bipeds, and they make sounds. What are they? And of course, some people said, Juan Gines de Sepulveda in particular, I'll talk about him in a moment, God so loves the Spaniards, he created an entire continent of natural slaves for us, waiting for us to fulfill their lives by ordering them about. And a number of Spanish philosopher theologians, at this time it's a little hard to distinguish between the two, stand up and say, that's not right. And this man, Francisco de Vitoria, writes a book in defense of these people and their rights. Inasmuch as he's a person, every Indian has free will, is the master of his actions, and by natural law has the right to his own life and to physical and mental integrity, including opposing coercive baptism and compelling them to come to church. And of course, you notice this person is a church figure and said this is a sin to compel them to come to church. Among other things, you compel them to commit the sin of hypocrisy. If someone doesn't really have the faith and you make the person come in and profess the faith, you have compelled the person by force to commit a sin. So you cannot claim you are acting in a moral and just way. Very clever argument. And then later, this man, Bartolomé de las Casas, who had gone to the New World as a young adventurer, it seemed like the great place to be, and what he saw horrified him. And he was converted by an itinerant priest who said, don't you see what is happening here? Don't you see the murder, the horror? And he opened his eyes to this nightmare being visited on these people. And in 1550, he engaged in a debate with Juan Gines de Sepulveda before the fathers of the church in Spain, and he won. His arguments were so compelling, and you can find them, by the way. They're available in Latin and Spanish and English and maybe other languages as well, in defense of the Indians. And he rebuts the arguments systematically, carefully, and smashes them. And he points out, he says, there are kingdoms, people, they live in society, they have all these things. They buy, they sell, they lend, they make contracts. They're people. They're not just things. And as he also pointed, now remember, he's arguing before the church, and he says, do you want them to come into church and worship? If so, recognize them as human beings. You don't bring your donkeys into church to take communion. And this is quite powerful argument. You can see how they're trapped here. They say, you're right, either they're like animals and we don't bring them in to take communion, or they're human agents and we want them in communion with the church. Which one? And he said, you have to choose. And he concluded, it's very magnanimous. The Indians are our brothers, and Christ has given his life for them. Why then do we prosecute them with such inhuman savagery? And by the way, in his books, he documented horrors. Human flesh sold in butcher shops as food for dogs. And human beings hunted from horseback for sport by Spanish lords who would stab them in the back and then bring them in as trophies. He said, this cannot be right. He said, the past, because it cannot be undone, must be attributed to our weakness. And then here's remarkable, provided that what has been taken unjustly is restored. And that is the key. You must restore to them what you have stolen from them. You cannot undo the crimes of the past, but you can give back what you have taken. And unsurprisingly, his follower, Francisco Marroquin, who becomes Bishop of Chiapas, following him, roughly Guatemala and southern Mexico, that area has a very high, maybe the highest percentage of indigenous population in the entire region because the church defended them from the enslavement and the horror, and because of this commitment to human rights. And there's now a university, Universidad Francisco Marroquin, dedicated to his ideas, which is a place you'll find the Ayn Rand statues and quotes also there as well. Now, this idea is picked up again, so in England, by the Levelers. And the Levelers, that's not the name they gave themselves. It was applied to them by their critics, who said, you want to level all human beings, like communism or something like that. They said, no, we want everyone to be equal before the law. And that was their non-negotiable demand. And Overton put it very neatly, to every individual, nature is given an individual property by nature, not to be invaded or usurped by any. For everyone as he is himself, so he has a self-propriety, else could he not be himself. Your own personal identity is dependent on your freedom. To be an independent person, to have an identity, you must be free. And these people, by the way, really meant it. They spent many years in prison, were tortured. They believed in the rights of women. They believed in the rights of Catholics, although all of them were Protestants, as far as we know. They were so extreme, so radical in their view. They held a view that even today is considered edgy. They believed even Irish people have rights. I know. It's kind of out there on the edge. But in Burford, if you want to go to England someday, a beautiful part of England, it's not that far from Oxford, but you have to take a bus or drive there. There's no train. Little village there where levelers who were in the army at the time, the New Model Army, were ordered to invade Ireland. And they said, no, you cannot force us to commit an act of injustice. We will not commit cruel war and persecution over matters of conscience, the Irish being Catholic and this army being Protestant. You cannot make us commit this unjust act. And they were executed there. Lord Fairfax brought another contingent, an army of men at the order of Oliver Cromwell, and shot them against the wall. And you can see the bullet holes where they were shot. But they said, we are free from the soles of our feet to the crowns of our heads. And we will not do this. And they paid with their lives. Another one, Thomas Rainsborough, put it in the famous Putney debates. He said, everybody has to have a voice. Everybody is equal before the law. Not in every other regard. We're not equally good singers or runners or anything like that. But we are all equal before the law. The poorest man in England is not at all bound in a strict sense to that government. He has not had a voice to put himself under. The poorest he, and it's unfortunate here that this is gendered. It's a weird feature of English. But given their general view of rights of women, we can suppose he meant human being, that is in England hath a life to live. Notice that. Hath a life to live as the greatest he. Everybody has a life to live. And it doesn't matter if the person is poor or comes from a remote district or speaks a different language or goes to a different church or to no church. Everybody has a life to lead. And then Locke picks up on this. Locke never quotes any levelers. By the way, many of these men were executed. And so you don't say, as the notorious executed figure so-and-so said. It gets you in trouble. We should also point out there's historical continuity. Francisco de Vitoria had studied in Paris, which was known to have Marsilian influence. But Marsilius cannot be quoted by a Catholic churchman in Spain because in church doctrine he is referred to as the accursed Marsilius. So you're not going to say, as the accursed Marsilius has argued. This won't fly very well. But you can see the influences even though they're afraid to quote them. And it's very clear. So John Locke has many leveler treatises or tracts in his library, and there are so many passages that are just parallel to the leveler arguments. He says, every man is a property in his own person. That language is interesting. He doesn't say you're a self-owner. That's a bit incoherent, in my opinion. He says, you have a property in your person. You have a right to control your own life, your body, your life, your choices, what you think, what you say. That's for you. And everybody has this equal right. Now let's think a little bit about this liberty idea, what it means to be a free person. And here we can go back to something that is addressed by Locke. The critics of this, the advocates of absolute power, and the idea that the state is above the law, argue freedom would just be chaos. Because freedom just means doing whatever you want to do. So if you just want to go punch someone in the nose, this is freedom. If you want to burn down your neighbor's house, freedom. Everything you want to do is freedom. And that would lead to chaos. So we can't have that. So this is the argument given by Sir Robert Filmer, for example, who argued for royal absolutism, that the king is above the law. Someone has to be the boss, because if we all have freedom, we'll eat each other. So somebody has to have the absolute power to control us all, or we will systematically misbehave. But it's not liberty as it's understood in the liberal tradition, which is a social and a political construct, not just desire. You might desire to do things that you're restrained by justice from doing. Right? So someone says, oh, that person is beautiful or handsome, I want to kiss that person. Well, really, you need to ask permission first in some way or another. You can't just walk around kissing people, grabbing them. That's bad manners at the least, and it's going to get a slap or a punch in the nose for doing it, and justifiably so. Well, Locke put it very neatly. He connected law and liberty very intimately. And this is something, when I read this years and years ago, I didn't get it until I had spent time in countries that don't have the rule of law. And I began to appreciate why the rule of law is so important. The end, by which he means here the purpose or the goal of law, is not to abolish or restrain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom. Where there is no law, there is no freedom. I think these are some of the smartest words written in political thought. Where there is no law, there is no freedom. Gisli will know very well, and Magnus, if he's here someplace, from the saga Brennu Njal saga, the saga of Burnt Njal, which is a great work in Icelandic literature. With law is our land built up, and with lawlessness laid waste. And the key figure in Njal saga, which is a great, I highly recommend, it's a great story, is a lawyer. who is the hero. Gunnar, who is a warrior, is really the secondary figure, or maybe tertiary. He's important. But the hero of the story is a lawyer. It's law that protects our freedom. For liberty is to be free from restraint and violence from others, which cannot be where there is no law. Freedom is not, as we are told, and here he's referring to Sir Robert Filmer, whom I mentioned, the advocate of absolute royal power, a liberty for every man to do what he lists. This is old-fashioned English. A ship lists, means it's leaning. So what you list is what you are inclined, what you want to do. For who could be free when every other man's humor, that means whim, might domineer over him? But a liberty to dispose in order as he lists, his person, actually it should be singular, I apologize for that, his person, actions, possessions, and his whole property within the allowance of those laws under which he is, and therein not to be subject to the arbitrary will of another. And that's the key. To be subject to the law, which is equal for everyone, and not to the arbitrary power of a tyrant. Or whether the tyrant is on a small scale in a village or on the big scale of a whole country, it doesn't matter. Not to be subject to the arbitrary will of another person. Now, there's some ethical foundations of this that I think are worth reviewing. They weren't just discovered in 1959 or 1960 or something. That allows people to live together. In the Analects of Confucius, Zhigong asks, is there one expression that can be acted upon until the end of one's days? Which means consistently. It's an elegant way of saying to act consistently as a guide for life. And Confucius says there is shu. Do not impose on others what you yourself do not want. If you don't want someone punching you in their face, don't do that to other people. It's a pretty simple principle that even children begin to learn between the ages of 3 and 80. Let's put it that way. Different people at different times. But usually about 3 is when kids begin to have some awareness. Don't hit other people. Don't take their stuff. And it's a hard lesson, by the way, that they learn usually between 3 and 5, and then politicians after they retire. And then also, from the Jewish tradition, Hillel, there's a case in which a Gentile, that is to say a non-Jew, comes to another teacher, another rabbi, convert me on condition that you teach me the entire Torah while I am standing on one foot. Right? And the other teacher pushes him away. He says, this is ridiculous. Then he goes to Hillel. And Hillel converts him. That which is hateful to you, do not do to another. That is the entire Torah. The rest is interpretation. Go and study. Right? It's a very brilliant expression. That's it. And the rest is interpretation. Go read Torah. Go study it. But that's the heart. So that fundamental principle, don't do to other people what you wouldn't want done to yourself. Sometimes called the silver rule, in contrast to the so-called golden rule. The golden rule, do unto others what you would have them do unto you. That's a harder one to follow. I wish someone would give me $1 million, so do I have to give the other people $1 million? That's a little bit difficult to instantiate. But the silver rule is a negative one. It's much easier. Don't do stuff to other people you wouldn't want people to do to you. And that is something that everybody can respect and follow in our lives. Now, following from this idea of a rights-ordered society based on equal principles or equal application of the rules, this key idea, the presumption of liberty, and this is important on epistemic grounds. Sometimes people present liberty as absolute. I have an absolute right to smoke. Well, not really. It's conditioned. Not in my house, right? If I'm a non-smoker. I have the right to wear a hat. Well, not when you walk into a certain kind of house of worship. If you go into a Quaker house, you take it off. If you go into a synagogue, you put it on. Those are the rules there, right? Now, this notion of Anthony de Josset, well worth reading, and his books are available online from Liberty Fund. Quite brilliant Hungarian, British, French economist and philosopher. I just highly recommend his works. They're so clear and so insightful. He says anything that you want to do is permissible unless sufficient reason is shown why it should not be permissible. There's a presumption if you want to do it, you can do it, unless there's a reason you shouldn't be allowed to. So it's what we call defeasible. But the burden of proof is on the one who shows you should not be allowed to do it, not on you to say, I should be allowed to do it. It's a question of burden of proof. It's very much like the presumption of innocence in law. So I come to you, I say, ma'am, I'm going to charge you with robbing a bank on April 4th. Prove you didn't do it. Well, that's a very hard thing to do. She might be able to prove it. Okay, you robbed it on the 3rd. Prove that. You can't disprove every charge I can bring against you. So in law, most systems, the burden of proof is on the prosecutor, the one making the claim. I have to prove you did it. You don't have to prove you didn't. It's very important. It's not possible to discharge the burden of proving you didn't do the following 500 things I could charge you with. The burden is on me. And similarly, the burden is on me to say why you should not be allowed to do something, not on you to why you should be allowed. So we take the simple case of the alternative, the presumption of power. And this, by the way, is the background modality for most contemporary thinking about law and politics, is the presumption of power. I'm sorry, it's true, but this is what we have to struggle against, this presumption. And that is that some person or group has the power to deny or to grant permission. So, you want to bake a cake for your daughter's birthday. Count the candles here. I think she's about 8 years old. I want to bake a cake for my daughter. What do? Under the presumption of power, I go to the Ministry of Baking and I submit a request for a license. I wish to bake a cake for and they say, is this for a son or a daughter? Or non-binary? I say, oh, well, this is for my daughter. Oh, that's down the hall. That's girls' cakes are down the hall. You have to go there to get the permission to be able to do that. But the presumption of liberty says, bake the damn cake with your own ingredients that you buy or grow or whatever. It's your ingredients, bake the cake. You don't have to ask permission. But it's possible there might be a sufficient reason for others to stop you. For instance, your oven generates sparks that burn down the neighborhood. An example, you cannot light off fireworks during the midst of a drought in the state of Colorado in the summer. You will burn down the neighborhood. So you can't say, it's my freedom to light fireworks. Say, well, okay, normally yes, but burning a mountain and all the houses on it is not your freedom. And it's legitimate to restrict fireworks during the dry season. It's not, to me, a burdensome restriction on freedom, but they have to justify why that is. And not just say, we don't like fireworks, or we don't like you. Now, this idea of social harmony and order emerges out of a rights-governed system. And this is a very important part of liberalism that's worth thinking about why respect for rights of other people matters. So what is order? We hear people talk about law and order. It used to be, by the way, a liberal phrase. But when I say used to, I mean well over 100 years ago. Now, when you hear it, it's an authoritarian phrase. It means someone with a big club is going to smash you in the face. They call that law and order. I would call it illegality and disorder. So they've captured that. But the original idea of a lawful, orderly society was articulated by liberals. But what is the order? Well, Hayek put it very neatly. An overall order, they do not only do not unnecessarily interfere with one another, but in those respects in which the success of the action of the individuals depends on some matching others by others, there'll be a good chance that this correspondence will occur. So it's not the kind of logically rigorous definition. It says it's a good chance. So a simple example, which I'll talk about in a moment. When I go to a grocery store, there are groceries there. Amazing. How did that happen? By the way, when I would go to the Soviet Union, you would go to produkty, to grocery stores, and there were no groceries. But if you went to Germany at that time, you went in, and there's food there, and stuff from all over the world, right? Like, I mean, just look, there are kiwi fruits here. Can you imagine a Serbian king of 700 years ago with a kiwi fruit? This is unimaginable, right? How did they get there? How is it possible that things came from, I don't know where kiwi fruits come from, Kiwi land or someplace, but not here, I'm pretty sure of it. They got here somehow. Well, these three reinforcing parts: rights, order, and then rule of law or limited government. People can debate how we instantiate that. And those support each other a bit like the legs of a tripod. When rights are well defined and legally secure, you get a more orderly society. It's more likely there will be groceries in the grocery shop, to take such a simple example. But law is there to define and protect rights, but not to create the order, and this is the key. Rulers and politicians say, I will create the order. That's a mistake. If they have a role, it's just to help us defend our rights, and we will create the order in an outcome of our interactions. Now, a little digression about rights and how we use the term. In a variety of European languages, I don't know about the others, but we have this phrase, right and right. So we talk about the right thing to do and my right to do it or not do it. And some rather facile or shallow philosophers have said that liberalism is contradictory to say you have a right to do what isn't right. But I think you do. Behaving rudely is not right, but I think people have a right to be rude, and we have the right not to be around them or to correct them. We can think of even more serious examples of that, self-destructive behavior, and so on. And so we can distinguish between these two concepts and how in liberalism, by originally pre-liberal thinkers, these are integrated. So objective right, Aristotle talks about dike or dikaiasune. It's a disposition or a habit which renders men apt to do just things, which causes them to act justly, to wish what is just. So it refers to the objective state of the world. And when I talk about objective, subjective, I don't mean it in the sense that may be in the backs of your minds. I talk about the objective state of the world, and then when I say subjective, the right of the subject. Not subjective in meaning arbitrary, but the right of the subject. So Aristotle talks about justice or dike, the right, as doing what is right, the state of the world. Ulpian, a great Roman lawyer, has a different approach. This we call subjective right. It's the will to render unto everyone his right, and here the Latin ius, to render to each his own. So to do what I'm supposed to do with respect to you, your right. I owe you 1,000 dinars. I need to give you 1,000 dinars. You have a right to the 1,000 dinars. And St. Thomas Aquinas, such an interesting figure, he's often remembered historically for connecting Christianity and Aristotle. He does more than that. One of them is bringing in Roman law. He says, look, you have to understand these are connected. He says we can have both if we understand them right. And he quotes Isidore Seville, rendering to each one his right, a man is said to be just because he respects the rights of others. That's really important. And it undercuts this idea of so-called social justice, if you will, that there's justice and social justice. They're two different things. He says if you act justly and everyone acts justly, you get a just society. And that's really important. That rights are a way of producing a just society. Robert Nozick, without having read Thomas Aquinas, comes to the same conclusion. He says, whatever arises from a just situation by just steps is itself just. So there's no just ordering of the world as such that we can know in advance and impose on the world. The just ordering is the one that emerges when people act justly, respecting the rights of each other. Not only my rights, but my respect for yours. So that we end up with an orderly society, not like an army is ordered or gravestones in a cemetery are ordered, but one that is orderly. That you end up with these examples of society being orderly. People can coordinate their behavior voluntarily. It doesn't mean all plans are realized. Of course, I introduce a product to the market, people don't like it, I lose my money, my plans were not realized. So it's not that all plans are harmonized, that's not possible. But we end up with, when the rules are followed, an orderly and a cooperative, nonviolent society. And it's that framework that brings about social coordination. Let me end with a couple of quick thoughts from cognitive psychology. So I've just recently been reading in. It turns out that if you go through life saying, I'm just a failure, I screw up, they're right about me, I'm just no good, you will feel bad about yourself. And there's a causal relationship between those. Now, it's not to say that it's the only way to address depression, but a lot of people find just stopping saying those negative things about themselves helps them to overcome bad feelings. The way you think will affect the way you feel. But there's a corollary of this as well. And that is the way that you feel will affect the way that you think. And here, this was this horrifying neo-Nazi march in the US. This picture captured, I think, fairly well. The rage and anger expressed. And going through life being angry and full of rage will lead you to collectivism. And I think we have seen this demonstrated. It's not logically necessary, it's a psychological predilection. That a movement that embraces hatred is going to become collectivist, even if they start out saying, no, it's freedom we want. Collectivists are just better at hating other people, and that will be what will attract them. But there is a philosophy that embraces this. Some of you may know Carl Schmitt, a particularly loathsome and evil person in my opinion, but also very brilliant, well worth reading. This is a great attack on liberalism. I recommend reading it. It's one of the smartest attacks on our philosophy I've ever read. And he says the key distinction is between the friend and the enemy. The enemy is the one you are willing to kill as a collectivity. This idea has other roots who have maintained philosophies of enmity. Marxism is about that. All histories have been histories of struggle. Martin Heidegger, his lectures that came out that he gave during the National Socialist period that were suppressed, he gave orders not to release them for many, many years. They're a poison pill sent to the future. He says, we have the advantage that the question of who we ourselves are is timely. Distinguished from liberalism, the I time now is the we time. And it will be us against them in a life and death struggle, to hate them. The Jews being the obvious example, but all the other Slavs and races and ethnicities that he wanted to extinguish. But it's still with us. There's a very famous circus clown, Slavoj Žižek. He talks about, he misunderstands Schmitt. Schmitt didn't think it was only conflicts between, say, Germans and Russians. It was Germans against German-speaking Jews, the ones he really considered the enemy, the internal enemy. And Žižek doesn't get that. But he says we should insist on the unconditional primacy of the inherent antagonism. Society is inherently antagonistic. Male, female, tall, short, black, white, light, dark. Any binary is a form of antagonism for him. And we see this now permeating this right-wing movement, identitarianism, racism, us against them, this figure Jared Taylor, whites, it's just natural in his view, they should want to be with their own kind. And if they have to kill off all the non-white people, hey, can't make a revolution without breaking a few million eggs. So why not? That's his essential philosophy. But in fact, enmity is not inevitable. It's a matter of choice. And let me conclude then with a great hero of mine, Liu Xiaobo. He's the second Nobel Peace Prize winner to die in prison. The first one died in the Third Reich. The second one, Chinese Communist Party prison. Not that very long ago, as you can see. And his last testament is very brilliant, and you can find it online and read it. It's extremely powerful. He says, in effect, you cannot make me hate you. I have control of myself. And he even says to the judge, you are not my enemy. And to the prosecutors and the guards, which is very hard to do when he knows what they are doing to him. And he gives his speech to his last speech to his wife, who was present in the courtroom. Enemy mentality will poison the spirit of a nation, incite cruel mortal struggles, right? Hinder your progress toward freedom and democracy. He wants to transcend his personal experiences. We understand when people hurt us, we hate them. But we don't have to. And if we consume our lives in hatred, we will end up becoming just like them. And we will become collectivists and enemies of our own freedom as well as theirs. So I'll conclude with that and leave that and turn it back over to our host. So thank you very much. So there's a time for some conversation then?
Yes.
Okay. I'm very interested in your thoughts as well, so I'm not going to answer questions in that usual sense. Do we have one up here then?
You mentioned the presumption of liberty, which is a beautiful concept, but it begs the question, when you say that the liberties should be restricted only when it's justified, sometimes this justification may not be obvious. So how can we make sure that these justifications are actually fair and not decided by those in power or by the majority of the society in expense of the individual?
Well, that's a great response and a great question. So I'll give you a couple of simple examples of things that have been offered as justified restrictions, but were ridiculous and mere covers for exercise of power. When Russia began its hostilities, the Russian state, I should be more careful, when the Russian state began its hostilities against Georgians, they banned the importation of Borjomi, the amazing mineral water from Georgia, on health grounds. Suddenly, and Russian people love Borjomi water, it's going back for a very long time, but suddenly, oh my God, we discovered it has toxic bubbles in it or something. So health grounds. So there's a justification. You might think, oh, okay, maybe. We can set aside for the moment issues about, well, you should make your own choice about what bubbles you want to consume. So let's assume there was some danger to public health. Also, they banned wine and so on. And this is so obvious. This was merely a foreign policy move to bring them under the boot of the Kremlin. And then there are many laws that have been passed where it has a facially neutral justification, but it in fact targets a particular ethnic, or racial, or religious group. But they're not mentioned in the law. This is a constant feature of statist rules. They became embarrassed by saying, we want to hurt Chinese people, African Americans, Orthodox, Christian, Muslim, Jew, whatever. So they'll just say, what are the characteristics of that group? And then write some law, which they justify on some other grounds, to hurt them. How can we be alert to that? Well, the first point is there's a presumption against legislation. right? There should be a presumption they have to actually discuss this and justify it in open public debate, and that there are legal principles in which you have a divided political system or division of powers with an independent judiciary and so on that can strike these things down. So in American jurisprudence, it's called substantive due process. There's due process of law that they have to say we passed it in the legislature, but the substance of it also matters. And if in fact we find that this law will be exceptionally harmful to this group of people and that it was really a cover for hurting them, it can be struck down on those grounds. But you raise this deep question. There's no algorithm that I can just punch into a computer or a calculator that'll always tell me the answer. We don't live in that world. In a certain sense, I wouldn't want to. It would be a world without human agency. But we do want to be active as citizens, questioning and challenging, and then having the legal means of going to independent judiciary, going to the media, going to public opinion, going to elections, and so on, to be able to stop these kinds of things. But yeah, it's a very deep and powerful question that you raised. Right here?
Okay, I will talk
Loudly.
Yeah, thank you. So you talked a little bit about religion, and I have just a short question. Do you think that in the modern world nowadays, liberty and religion, any interpretation of the existence of God, they are compatible and they can go alongside?
I have no doubt of that, or no reason to doubt it. If you think about some of the people who have been the most courageous champions of liberty, they've often been people who are deeply motivated by religion. And it can be in Muslim context, Christian, Jewish, Hindu. There are such a variety of religious faiths around the world. You might find a religion that defines itself as, say, requiring human sacrifice. We conquer the other village. Well, yes, this particular religious viewpoint is not compatible with a free society. So I'll grant that. But I don't think that that would be true of religion as such. And one thing also to think about religion, my eyes have opened a bit. So I live in Thailand, and Thai religiosity is very different from the one that was around me when I grew up. It's a very different view of the world. There's not some old guy with a big white beard who made everything, right? The cartoon view of the Abrahamic tradition. It's completely different. Or you think about other religions around the world that don't have that same format. The variety of religious experiences is extremely vast. And yes, I do think that they're compatible with respect for other people, with living the life of a free person. There are some religions that, in a certain sense, are kind of inherently liberal because they reject violence altogether. So we think about the Anabaptist tradition and what they're called Amish, or the plain people. They call themselves the simple people. They don't hurt each other. They don't slap their children. They don't use any violence against anybody, anytime. It's not a community I would want to live in. They have their own rules and so on, and the ultimate sanction is you get expelled, which is an extremely terrible price to pay, to lose connection with family and friends and your community. But about half of the population, they say, is lost to the world because they have the freedom to say, I would like to go out and go to cinema and have those other things in life. But then they give up this tight family and community, which is a hard thing to do. But they are part of a free society. They don't hurt anybody else. It's a lifestyle I wouldn't want to adopt. And indeed, about half of their children don't want to adopt it. But when you have 12 or 13 children, the population still grows. So those are completely compatible, in my opinion, with free society. And we can live side by side with them. I gather there's something inadequate about my response. Yes?
Yes, and most religions like require to be collectivist in terms of like you should follow these rules and you should become like part of the community. Is that computable too?
It would depend on what the sanctions would be for not becoming part of the community. So if the sanction is we imprison you, we burn you alive, something like that, yes, that's completely incompatible. And if you define a particular religion as having that characteristic, no, we can't live with those people. They can't continue to behave that way. Let's put it that way. But if they have all other kinds of things that say, think about very observant and orthodox Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, their lives are very importantly structured by the creeds of their religion. And their behavior is sometimes in very minute detail set by that. This is how they're going to behave, whether it's about the Sabbath or food, you know, that has to be halal or kosher and so on. And that doesn't threaten me or anybody else, if that's how they want to live their lives. And I should add one other element. Sometimes we take these things for a little bit for granted. I notice that there's no one in this room who's naked. But there are some parts of the world where people are naked. They don't wear clothes. Like, it's really hot in Papua New Guinea, and wearing woolen clothes and a tie is, there's a technical word in social philosophy, stupid, right? It's stupid to do that. So they don't do that. And they go around with what we would define as naked. And if someone walked in like that, we would all be pretty shocked by that. And I mean, maybe the hotel manager would say, "Ma'am, sir, you have to leave now." And we just think, oh, well, that's just normal. But that is part of our cultural background. We have an expectation people come in with most of their bodies covered when they enter into a public space like this. And although it's private, it's public to us. And so we shouldn't so quickly condemn other people, saying, oh, look how restrictive they are about those things. We just take our restrictions, our social norms, for granted. And so a little bit more alertness to that is helpful to expand our views. We had some other thoughts here? Up here? Yes, ma'am. Okay. Okay. Can you, even I'm having difficulty, just shout at me. Okay, the microphone. Yes, it's okay.
You already mentioned how technology shapes the idea of freedom and how it changes over time.
How what changes it?
Technology. Yeah. But what I mean, nowadays, like we have the Cambridge Analytica and judicial systems also failing to keep up with the protecting people's rights. And I wanted to know what do you think, like how dangerous technology and these digital tools can be threat to the liberty, and because like there is no legislation and there's no like structured world in a digital world, and idea is also changing and it's getting.
Did anyone not catch that in the back? Okay, so let me try to restate, and then you tell me if I am wrong. That technology changes, and should the idea of freedom, or should the experience of freedom, or the laws of freedom change in response to these changes? And in particular, in the digital world, where we have all kinds of things coming at us, and we don't already have an established body of law to govern these, has it broken down? Is it a failure? Or is there a liberal response? Is that fair?
I don't think it's like failure, but I was asking like what kind of dangers are like.
Okay. Well, first off, technologies have been changing for a long time. I think there's some way we can say a little bit more rapidly in your lifetimes than in most previous ones. But the rapid change has been the last 200 years or so, extremely rapid. And legal systems do need to adapt to that. They present new opportunities for externalities, for behavior that affects other people. So think about when radio came on, it was difficult in some cases to figure out how I can broadcast and you can broadcast without interfering with each other. Unfortunately, most places took the wrong approach, state ownership. Ronald Coase and others showed you could have had a property solution that would have been more effective. And over time, in some cases, they've been moving towards an allocative system that's more property-based. But to deal with the fact that my radio signal interferes with yours, which was not something people thought about in the 12th century, now we have to have a set of laws and legal principles to govern this. And that's, I just think, an omnipresent feature of living together, that we will discover new ways that we can benefit or harm one another, and that means new legal norms or new legal principles, but they should be rooted in certain accepted practices, not just something that someone thought up as the totally new approach. New threats with regard to liberty, I do think that there are some in the digital space, and in particular, a democratic political system. And by that, I don't mean unlimited majoritarianism. That's a self-destructive principle. But a democratic political system that can allow us to live together peacefully is one that requires conversation and discussion. And so in this book, which, by the way, you can download right here at zero price. So this is a kind of important principle. If you want to take a picture of that. Routledge, the publisher, they released it, they sold it for a year, made me fabulously rich from the royalties. As you can imagine how much money you get from academic books. So here's the book. But after 1 year, and when I gave them back all the royalties, they agreed to make it available at zero price. So you can download the whole book as a PDF. And I make the case with my co-author, Matt Warner, that sustainable democracy requires limited government. If it turns out you fear losing the election means you're going to lose your life, you won't lose the election. This is Putin's issue, right? You're riding the tiger, you've created so much power, you can't go into the loyal opposition because you killed the loyal opposition. And whoever is in power now will dispense with you. But a democratic system understood in this context of liberal democracy, rule of law, and limited government requires conversation. Conversation requires some ability to compare knowledge and facts. And now, in the digital world, brand names have been eroded. It used to be, I went to the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung or the Süddeutsche Zeitung, and I knew they had some orientation. But they're newspapers that are public, and then they can be criticized, and they'll run corrections when they're wrong. But now, you go online, and there's a newspaper called the Denver Guardian. You say, oh my God, the Denver Guardian said such and such. There is no such newspaper as the Denver Guardian. People who live in Denver know that, but it turns out most people don't live in Denver. And people who live in Miami or Copenhagen say the Denver Guardian said, whatever, Hillary Clinton had a lesbian affair, or she had Putin's love baby, or who knows what, craziness. And this is just proliferating. It's unbelievable. We're overwhelmed with phony disinformation. And a couple of states have taken advantage of that. Russia, the Kremlin, is really good at this. They have a long tradition of disinformatia, maskirovka, and so on. This is very deeply rooted in their military doctrines. But also China, a little bit less agile, North Korea, oddly enough, Iran, and then even some of the democratic countries do this usually in a less professional way. How do we get through that? And I'm not sure I know the answer, but the development of brand names again, of reliability, that this is one I can trust. At the same time, recognize in the digital world, people are trying to fool us all the time. You all know about phishing. Don't click on stuff. Don't do it. You will get infected. You always copy the link address, put it in a word processor, and look at it. And if it says, ha, I'm ripping you off, .com, don't click on it, right? So always be super careful in this world, because a democratic system does require conversation. Conversation requires reliability of information, not just lies, a fire hose of lies, which is what we see in much of the internet. And you have to be very careful as institutions are slowly emerging to help us do that. But we're in a very dangerous time right now because of exactly what you pointed to. Yes, ma'am.
Don't you think that the excessive glorification of individual rights can lead to total abuse of rights? And I also wanted to know your approaches to the concept of abuse of rights.
Can you tell me why you think that's the case? And a little bit louder for all of us.
I wanted to know, don't you think that the extreme glorification of individual rights and freedom or liberty can lead to the abuse of rights and misuse of those rights?
What would be an example, though, just to help me understand better?
For example, freedom of expression, when I glorify my freedom of expression and I ultimately use some offensive expressions for others or people that are present here.
Okay, maybe I understand then. So I think I see your point. The mere fact that I might have the right to say something offensive is not a good enough reason for me to do it. And there are a lot of people on the internet who have the mentality of teenage boys, but are 50, who don't understand that. So think about offensive ethnic slurs, right? A lot of them, you just immediately, the ones for your own group, right? They just pile out. We know them. And just because I should have the liberty to say it if I want to doesn't mean I ought to do that. That there's a self-restraint not to be a horrible person and insult and demean other people. The fact that you have the liberty to do something doesn't mean you ought to do it. That's fundamental. And so right now, when we're seeing, and here again in this digital space, it's sad to me that collectivist right-wingers, or right-wing collectivists, collectivism comes in many flavors, left, right, up, down, are saying we're free speech advocates because we want to call you, and then we can list all the horrible views. That's free speech, is coming up to another person and demeaning them. That's what free speech is. And it's sad to me that they have colonized this space as free speech advocates when they're not. They just want to say naughty words because it's exciting if you're 11. But in fact, these people are 30 or 40 or 50, and they have the mentality of the 11-year-old. And that, I think, is a big problem. I don't think that rights properly understood lead to chaos, though, for several reasons. One is that we have other norms that govern us, norms of civility and proper behavior and needing to live with our neighbors and get along with them, and so on. So this scary scenario doesn't undercut the case for rights in my mind. But you're right, just having the liberty to do something doesn't mean you ought to do it. That's where we understand liberty is not the only value in life. We have one last one.
So as quick as I can. Given what you were explaining about the silver rule and that we ought not to do things that we wouldn't want done to us, how do you account for the fact that different people have different expectations and different morals? You know, to take a really, you were using examples primarily about force and like you wouldn't want somebody to hit you, and like on the surface that seems very basic, but you have, for example, the Nietzschean view that might makes right, and so people should be able to hit you, and it's whoever hits hardest is best. Or you have maybe that seems a little bit out there, but you have, for example, in Muslim countries, not exactly that, a woman would want to be hurt or have female genital mutilation, but that's the expectation, that's the norm, and so she does not protest. So how do you deal with that sort of thing?
Well, there are people who don't protest against such things for a variety of reasons, but those who do protest absolutely deserve our defense. I remember when I was in Egypt many years ago and with a classical liberal group there, and there was a young woman who wore hijab, and she comes from a very, very, very observant family. And a young cousin was going to be subjected to this mutilation. And the little girl was a young woman, but she was terrified of this and did not want it. And Dalia had the courage to stand up and defend her and protect her, because this girl did not want this done to her. So it's imaginable there are some people willing to submit to this, and even they want to. I think things are going to change. That's a prediction as societies become more open. But that girl who said no had to be defended. And our Egyptian friends came, also the assistants, and I introduced her to lawyers who defended her cousin for her, and so on. So this is, and it was very hard for her to do, given her family background and what she suffered from. And another young friend of mine who I helped to escape, and he's living in Norway now, and his father called for him to be put to death because of what he said and did. If you could imagine the horror of that. They accused him of insulting Islam, which he hadn't done. He actually insulted the president of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak. And then related to this question, the accusation was insult to Islam, which actually wasn't true. And this was a terrible case, and there were people who came to his defense, a very brave people. And one of them, Jacob Mchamgamana, just published a book on free speech, the great book. Jacob was in Denmark, and he helped to connect our young friend Karim to a group that managed to get him out of Egypt and into Poland. And Poland gave him refuge, and then now in Norway. So even though those are the expectations, those people who say no, they deserve our defense. And they deserve the defense also of people who are willing to abide by those norms. And that's an important principle. So I know some people who are very observant Muslims who, a friend of mine in Afghanistan, he's defended the rights of Christian converts. But it's painful for him. He had to tell them when they would come and say, I'm converting, he would say, I understand, this is your faith, it's your business. I implore you, do not announce this, because the crazy people will come and they will kill you and your family. So, and he said, as a human rights lawyer, this is so painful to do. But he said, I had to say, I respect you. I accept that you have rejected my faith. But I implore you not to make it public because other people will murder you. And he said, I will try to help you to escape. Those are the people we need to rely on. So well, with that, I think we're out of time. I want to thank you. I'm going to go on to Budapest this afternoon. And keep on being rational. You do it well. Thank you.